Hey guys, let's talk about the Wingman Challenge really quick. I just finished this up last month and want to quickly relate my story. For those of you who don't know what the Wingman Challenge is, it's an 1,100-mile paramotor unsupported adventure that happened in the western United States. It's completely unsupported with the exception of two areas. One is an emergency situation where you have ground crew that will take the time, no matter where you are, to come and get you and make sure you're rescued. And the second is 3 mandatory rest days that are interspersed throughout the 2-week adventure. So 3 days of paramotoring, a mandatory rest day, and then 3 days of paramotoring again until you get to the finish line. I just want to pass on my story and some of the lessons I learned so that anyone who's interested in doing this, an Icarus race, or just cross-country and adventure flying in general, can learn from the mistakes that I made and hopefully take something away from it. So let's get right into it. Now, the first lesson I learned, and probably the most significant one to take away from my whole time in the Wingman Challenge, is simply this. Don't change too much at once. It sounds simple, but really when you're going into an adventure like this, when you're going to be stressing your limits, your equipment's limits, and just essentially traveling in an environment that you're not used to, you want to do as little that is brand new to you as possible when you start. So, for example, don't make your first flight in an Icarus race the first time that you launch with 5 gallons of gas and 20 pounds of kit attached to you. Don't let that be the first time you use a navigation app to navigate from point to point. Don't go into it without having learned how to estimate fuel burn and plan for fuel stops and using a map and building a route plan. I did myself a favor, and that was all stuff that I had done before in preparation for the Wingman Challenge, but what I did not do was fly on my motor before. I wanted to fly a specific machine, a Nirvana F-Lite, for this Wingman Challenge, and due to some production delays and other things, and just the fact that it was a brand new machine, I got the second one off of the assembly line, they had to ship it directly to the starting line. Not only that, I wanted to fly with what I perceived to be the best wing for the challenge, and I believe it proved to be that for me, but also it was brand new, and they got it also shipped to the finish line, or the starting line, just as the race was beginning, so I didn't have a chance to fly my motor or my wing once before the start of this challenge. Also, it was my first time ever flying at high altitude. All of my launch sites in the past have been 1,000 feet above sea level or less. So getting up to 7,000 feet where our first launch site was a real shock to me, and it was definitely a learning experience. And also with my new motor, I was switching to a high hang point machine. Pros and cons of that are out there, but it was my first time flying on one. So I had a new motor, a new wing, at high altitude, and a new high hang point harness, none of which I had ever flown even once before starting this challenge. And combined with all of the other things I just mentioned, it ended up being way too much new all at the same time, and it resulted in this situation. Launching with a high hang point machine, I was used to my hands being here when I launched for my low hang point machines that I've been flying for 2 or 3 years. But for a high hang point machine, my hands needed to be up here, and because of that I was pulling way too much brake on my launch and ended up stalling the wing, coming down on my knees, and instead of taking the damage to the equipment, where I would have been out of the challenge pretty much immediately because I've destroyed my motor, I, in that split second, decided I was going to take the hit on my body instead, and didn't prepare or think ahead and to wear knee pads or any other kind. I ended up taking a quarter-sized chunk out of my right knee, that's still healing by the way, that actually exposed my patellar tendon. At the moment I didn't feel it at all because of the adrenaline and everything else going on, and just the heat of the moment. The pain just wasn't registering, so I doused it in hydrogen peroxide, wrapped it in a bandage, and then attempted a second launch. And as you can imagine, when you try to do something again without changing anything, you're going to have a similar result. End up blowing the second launch as well, as you can see here. rest of the day, we were all licking our wounds and struggling because only 6 pilots even made it off the ground at the start line. At the high altitude, the weight, it was a lot of change for a lot of pilots. It was a reality check for every one of us at that altitude that this was going to be a little harder than we anticipated. And I toughed it out for that whole day, but by the evening, the adrenaline and the shame had worn off to the point that it really started to hurt. So I had a local paramedic look at it, and he immediately said, as soon as I bandaged it, that I needed to go to a hospital to get it treated. So Canyon from Team Fly Halo, who actually hosted this event, was kind enough to drive me and spend his whole evening going to and from the ER in Mammoth, which is an hour drive there and back, plus the time at the ER. Got x-rays and they took a look at it. Nothing was broken, but they did have to scrub and clean the asphalt out of the wound, especially the stuff that was touching my exposed, essentially, bone in my right knee. It was the most painful experience of my life. The good news out of all of this was that the doctor said that as long as I was willing to deal with worse scars, because I was going to tear open sutures when they put them in, I would be able to fly. It wasn't going to cause any permanent damage for me to continue with the adventure. So with that good news in mind, we drove back and I slept in one of Team Fly Halo's campers for that evening. And thanks Matt and Tyler for taking care of me on that. And that was all just day 1. 6 pilots got off the ground, no one made it more than 20 miles, and everyone else just dealt with the horrible weather conditions. Now day 2 really ended up being much the same. The weather was horrible. We had a couple pilots that got off the ground, and no one did more than just a test flight, going up feeling that the weather was dangerous to be in the air or to be flying in. And so they came down, and really no one flew or made any progress that day except for the few folks that were hitchhiking to make forward progress. So the ground crew, with almost every pilot right now grounded at the starting point because the weather was so bad, decided they're going to move the start line to Beatty Airfield in Nevada. So we all picked up camp, road trip for 4 or 5 hours over to the new start line, and arrived in the evening. So we are all of the pilots now are setting up to start the challenge the next morning. And that was pretty much all of day 2. It was pretty uneventful from a flying or an adventure standpoint. Now the morning of day 3 came around. I'd been licking my wounds for almost 2 days now, and I was ready to get into the air as long as I could stomach the pain. Borrowed a new pair of pants that had some knee pads so I didn't hurt myself anymore if I did fail another launch at some point. And fortunately I was able to set up and get into the air, and boy was I relieved to do it for all of about 10 seconds. Unfortunately, because I changed too much, I was also in a brand new harness, and as soon as I got in the air I realized that I couldn't just sit back and have the seat board come under me and pick me up. So I needed to use a hand to get into my seat. Now when I tried to do that, because I had never had a motor that required me to put my seat board down, which really was due to harness misadjustment because I had never hang tested this motor either, I inadvertently reached down with my throttle hand to get into my seat board, which of course when it mattered the most, when I'm doing that I hit the kill switch. Motor died and I come gliding down, don't have time to restart it because of the low altitude, and I'm coming right towards a barbed wire fence. So I had just enough flare authority to get over the barbed wire fence and then just dump all the rest of my flare right before touching the ground, able to safely put it down on a road where I could set up and launch again. And then, after getting in the air, my adventure finally started.
I'm good!
So now that I'm in the air, I'm finally in my element again. It was a beautiful flight for the first about 45 minutes. then just as soon as the sun rose and started creeping over the mountains, it started moving the air and a 10 to 15 mile an hour headwind developed. I went and tested the air from 3,000 feet all the way down to the ground level. The only place where there was any reprieve from that punishing headwind was about 7 feet off the ground, which I maintained for about the next hour. There were about 5 of us that launched and flew that same route that morning. I was the only one that found that sweet spot in the wind that was that low to the ground, which combined with the natural fuel efficiency of the Nirvana machines that I was still trying to learn and figure out, ended up saving me a ton of gas and allowed me to skip my first gas stop, which is in Amargosa Valley, Nevada. All the other pilots that were with me ended up stopping there to refuel, but unfortunately for them, the time that it took for them to get gas ended up grounding them because gusts started picking up to about 20 plus miles an hour into the late evening. So they ended up getting stuck there. I say it's unfortunate, but really me pressing on may have been the unfortunate event because they had sent a lot of pictures of them hanging out at the casino in Amargosa Valley with Coronas in their hand next to the pool. So I think they ended up actually having a better time than I did. With that said though, I ended up flying by. I had plenty of gas left to press on while the conditions were still flyable. So I climbed high to get over the mountain turbulence that I was definitely starting to experience as I was flying through a valley there. Ended up burning into the Calveda Meadows Airport in Pahrump, Nevada, full trims out. Unfortunately, I missed the landing for this one. Ended up nailing it though, gassed up at the avgas pump, and assessed the condition. So after landing and getting on the ground, I was really surprised. I still had over 5 liters of gas in the tank, which drove some of the key statistics for the flight. I was on a Nirvana F-Lite 200 flying a Warp 2 20 meter at 142 kilograms, so just at the max end of its weight range. The flight lasted 2 hours and 45 minutes, and I flew right at 69 miles for an average speed of 25 miles an hour. That was at an average altitude of 4,000 feet, burning 11 liters of gas total, with an average fuel consumption of 4 liters an hour. I thought this was great when I landed actually, but it turns out this would end up being some of the worst fuel performance I got while I was on the Wingman Challenge, which I attribute to it being the first hours on the motor, so it was in its break-in period, and it was less efficient because I was using break-in mix. Regardless though, now that I generally understood the performance of my machine, I only had 40 miles left to my destination and the weather seemed to be holding. So, as long as I could beat the thermals that the desert would kick out, I can make it to my final destination of Kingston Ranch in Mesquite Valley, California. This flight was mostly uneventful aside from some pretty decent thermals. But since I knew I had the range, even with a 10-mile-an-hour headwind, I just let trims out and used the tip steer on the Warp 2 the entire time, which did a fantastic job and surprised me actually with how well it handled the thermals, getting close to midday here in the high desert. Luckily also, at this time of day and this location on the journey, the rotor wasn't too bad coming off of the mountains, so I had some uniquely flyable weather. At this point, I'm pretty sure I was actually the only pilot in the air, where everyone else was grounded due to just strange wind formations coming off the mountains, causing pretty significant dust devils most everywhere else on the route. Trims fully out on the Warp 2, I made pretty fantastic time and ended up landing here at the final destination at Kingston Ranch just before noon. The conditions seemed to be decently favorable considering the time of day and the environment that we were in. Based off of the weather forecast the night before and the conditions that we were all expected to face, I actually ended up beating the ground crew to this destination. They did not expect any pilots to make it there today, or at least in the morning, due to just the challenging winds and conditions, but a combination of the fuel efficiency of the Nirvana and the general just top speed of the Warp 2 trims out allowed me to beat out most of the headwinds that we were facing and to fight through some of the more challenging conditions, and then just have the range to make the fuel stops to get ahead of the more significant bad weather that got stuck behind us. This flight ended up being just under an hour and a half long, covering 46 miles at an average speed of 32 miles an hour, which trims out almost the whole time into that headwind. Average altitude of 5,300 feet and a fuel burn of 4.3 liters an hour, which was still surprisingly good being trimmed out on that wing the entire time. I actually landed with well over half a tank of gas, including what was still left in my fuel bladder. It wasn't until after I landed that I realized that I had beaten the ground crew to the ranch. But fortunately, the owner of the ranch, Al, rode up to me on his horse and welcomed me to the property. I dropped my gear in the hangar, and he pulled up in a golf cart and gave me a grand tour, which was just incredible. And after the discouragement of the past few days and riding on the high of 2 amazing flights, this success was a really welcome feeling. I was the only pilot to make it to the finish line that day, but based on the photos from everybody else, it seems like they all had a pretty great time on their own. Once the ground crew arrived at the ranch, as the first pilot on the ground, I actually was offered to stay in the guest house too, which was pretty sweet. At this point, I was looking forward to a rest day to let my knees heal a little bit, but even more so, I was looking forward to the rest of the adventure. So more videos to come here in the future as my work life allows me to put these out as I break down the flights for the rest of the Wingman Challenge and do some more cross-country analysis on how this machine and the pilot performed throughout the rest of this. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.